Our guest speaker for the evening, Mr. Patrick Conroy, is quite an established and successful journalist and producer of various news stations. I'll talk about him a bit more later, but when I was working on an introduction for him this evening, a memory popped into my head of a story my grandfather told me about a presenter, a radio presenter from Springbok Radio, and I found it quite odd to be talking about Springbok Radio because I was born in 1991 and would never have heard a single thing from Springbok Radio, but based, and this might all be complete hearsay, based off what my grandfather told me, there was a famous presenter by the name of Eric Egan. So my grandfather wasn't a liar, and he had a very famous segment where he would say corny cracks or something, and one of the jokes he told was about how to catch a polar bear. And he said, you go and you dig a hole in the ice, and inside that hole you place a pea. And then you go and you hide yourself a few meters away. You make sure a polar bear won't see you. And when he comes to take a pee, you kick him in the ice hole. And radio standards being radio standards back then, the poor man was suspended for a few weeks. How times have changed. And that's sort of the past of radio in our country, and we're moving on to the present now. Mr. Patrick Conroy was the managing director of ENCA. He produced quite a few news segments for all of the affiliate news stations. He's had a career in print media for the Evening Standard in London. And he was a correspondent journalist, and I'm sure he'll go into more details in a second, for 702 during the 1996 expedition to Everest, the South African expedition. And I would like to invite him to come and deliver his speech to us this evening. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much. Just firstly, thank you to Mr. Reela for the invitation, also to Mr. Schroeder, who was my last headmaster. We crossed paths in 1990. And to Mr. Wilkes, it's very good to see you again. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. An insider told me what a great speaker James was and Kyle Brown. So just to bedazzle you, I've brought along a slideshow to make up for my shortcomings as an orator. So the story I'm going to share with you tonight is, sorry, I've got to kind of fire this manually, is the story of Everest. And I've done this talk for quite a few people. Usually I work with companies or executive teams talking about reputation management and crisis communications and how better they can handle it. So when the Ford Cougar started blowing up, Nissan asked me to quickly come and help them so that if they had a similar crisis, they knew what to do. But a lot of the background of getting into media actually started at Pretoria Boys High. And I call it, for me, it's the school of influences, because there was this fantastic headmaster called Malcolm Armstrong. He was this really, he had the foresight to see where the country was going. He engaged with the ANC in Lusaka in 1985 at a time when it was quite controversial to do so. And in assemblies, he would often talk about where the country's at, and he'd talk about humanity, and he'd talk about the principles of democracy, and he'd engage with us quite a lot. But the thing that stuck out for me about Mr. Armstrong was we were sitting in guidance in Form 1, and he asked the question, why do people publish newspapers? And of course the hands shot up, and it's like, so we can know what's going on in the news, sir, that we can be informed, that we can know the truth. And I rather cynically replied, to make money. And he said to me, boy, you should be a journalist. The next one was Eddie Dorey, and when I was trying to think which picture should I put up of Eddie Dorey, I could hear him in my head going, show them my abs, boy, show them my abs. Eddie Dorey, apart from being the worst Afrikaans teacher the world ever saw, Mr. Reela and I was just filling him in on Mr. Dorey's shortcomings as an Afrikaans teacher, but he was an amazing mentor, and he was a brilliant man, as many of you know, and could really connect with boys. But he was also, ironically, the team manager for our provincial karate team. I was in the provincial karate team, 88, 89, 90, and where all the styles would come together. And on one particular occasion, I had to fight, as Northern Transvaal, I had to fight my equal in Eastern Province. And the fight was going quite well, and I got punched in the nose. And I walked to the side of the mat, and Mr. Dory came up, and I said, I think my nose is broken. And he looked at me, and he goes, no, you're fine, punch in the nose, makes the eyes water. Come, just wipe your eyes, boy. Come, go finish this guy off. Use your hands. Okay, sir, run off. And I won. Fantastic. I walked off the mat, and Mr. Dory came to me, he put his arm around me, and took me for a little walk, and I said, where are we going? He said, to the medics, your nose is broken. Mr. Dory finally said to me when we were sitting there and they were looking at my nose, he said, little things will stop you doing big things. If I told you your nose was broken, you would have withdrawn from the fight, or you thought you could have lost. Don't let little things stop you from doing big things. And that has always stuck with me. The last thing was, I think one of the things about Boys High is not always learning Pythagoras' theorem or cos theta, all of that stuff, which I stopped doing after matric and never touched again. It's sometimes just these chance encounters that Boys High gave you. And one was a speech by General Jannie Geldenhuys, who came and spoke to the cadets. And he said something that just stuck in my head. It was about leadership. And he said, leaders bring a situation to its most stable point, not the ideal. Now, of course, if you can achieve the ideal, do it. But sometimes you're going to have to make a sacrifice. Leaders are going to have to bring a situation to its most stable point, and it's not the position that they ideally wanted to be at. And these lessons kind of rung with me as I went to Everest. So this is my CV on paper, but don't worry about it. So the story is Everest 1996. Now, this was probably one of the most controversial, infamous years in the history of the mountain. Books have been written about 1996. Movies have come out. People have made lots of money doing Hollywood blockbusters and writing books like Into Thin Air. But exactly what happened in 1996 is still a bit of a mystery. No one really knows exactly how it all unfolded. So what happened was Radio 702 decided that they were going to cover the first Everest expedition. We just won the Rugby World Cup in 1995. We had won the African Cup of Nations against Tunisia. Well done. 2-0 in the final. And, of course, now there was this opportunity to go and be the first South African team to climb Everest. And kind of the mood in the country was anything is possible. Everest will be a doddle. So there was just one problem. No senior reporters at 702 wanted to go. When it was presented to us, who wants to go to Mount Everest? Look, you're going to have to sleep on a glacier. You'll probably be there for 2 or 3 months. It's going to be very, very cold. You're going to have to eat yak stew every day. I couldn't think of anything better. And I was like at the back with my hand up. None of the senior reporters wanted to go. So the management had a problem. They're like, listen, sleep on it, think about it, write an application, have it in on Monday. And on Monday, mine was the only one in. So as the sole applicant, I forced my employer to pick me because those others let little things stop them from doing big things. True quote, Andrew Barnes said, how far up the mountain can I wear my Italian shoes? So the Eddie Dory principle applied. So anyway, after being dropped off by helicopter in the mountains, it's about a 9-day trek from the nearest little village that they drop you off, a place called Lukla, and you slowly ascend up to base camp trying to acclimatize. Base camp is about the same height as Kilimanjaro, just to give you an example. So here I am, it's, pardon my Nepalese, but just outside a little village called Phakding. P-H-A-K Ding. And I did ask the guide, are you sure? Is that how you pronounce it? He's like, yeah. I didn't want to insult him. But I had no means of communicating with the outside world, right? So if I was half dead on the mountain or suffering from altitude sickness, I had no means of communicating with the outside world. I didn't even think about it myself. I just wanted to get there. But my employer, if I once having landed in Kathmandu and flown out by helicopter, if they never heard from me until I got to base camp, they had no means of contacting me. In fact, they didn't even think about it. So we hadn't really done our homework as what would happen if something went terribly wrong on the mountain, or I just didn't emerge 9 days later in base camp. The expedition had gone on ahead of me. They had, for various reasons, been there earlier, and it was led by a guy called Ian Woodall, a British-born citizen but naturalized South African, and it was his idea to climb Everest as the first South African expedition. He was joined by his best friend, a photographer, also a Brit, called Bruce Herod, and then Cathy O'Dowd, a local up-and-coming climber, was the lead female climber on the team. And then making up the rest of the team was Deshaun Daisel, also a climber, and then Ian's brother Philip was the base camp manager. And then I came in kind of as the reporter who would, report it all from base camp. This is a little sketch from my diary. I'm sorry if it's a bit small for people at the back. Just kind of showing what you have to do to ascend Everest. You have to go up a number of various camps. I'll show, it'll become clearer in a minute. But roughly that's the picture I was trying to draw. Base camp is just a little bit down to the left, just out of shot. So that's what base camp looks like. It looks like it's solid ground. It's not. It's in fact dust and rock that has fallen down on top of the glacier. The glacier is in fact several hundred meters thick. Now there was trouble in base camp. There were big commercial expeditions that were there, and what had happened is mountaineering was going through a bit of a shift. Classical mountaineering had paved the way for these lucrative guided climbs. Up until this point, people who climbed Mount Everest and other high Himalayan peaks were essentially hippies with ice axes, right? They would slog away doing their jobs to save enough money to go and climb. Until a few climbers realized they could make a lot of money by guiding people, if so to speak, to the summit. Clients were paying in 1996 $65,000 US each to be a member of the team, no guarantee of the summit. So this added a commercial pressure onto a really risky undertaking already. If climbing Everest wasn't dangerous enough, these expedition leaders had to guarantee or at least show that their business model could work. And the two guys who were leading this was a New Zealander called Rob Hall and an American called Scott Fisher. And these guys were legends. You couldn't go anywhere on the trail up to base camp without seeing their posters in all the various little lodges and villages. Now, weather reports suggested that on the 10th of May, 10th to the 11th of May, the jet stream winds that batter the top of Everest would lift, and it would be a good time to go and climb. Now, bear in mind, this was before apps, this was before GPS was available. These weather reports were determined by none other than the Swedish Meteorological Society, and everyone would tune in on the shortwave radio to find out if it was good enough to climb. Now, the problem is, Fisher and Hall didn't want the other teams to climb during this window period. They didn't want to have to rescue smaller, inexperienced teams and didn't want to have them clogging the route, because at parts of Everest, it's very, very narrow, and if you have too many climbers there, it causes delays. Ian Woodall, the South African expedition leader, aggressively refused. He told them where they could stick it, and that they didn't own the mountain, and that he would climb the mountain when he damned well pleased. That was his tone. Technically, he was right. He had every right to climb the mountain whenever he was. They didn't own it. But what happened was, it immediately created this divide between the big commercial expeditions and the so-called smaller, inexperienced ones. So what happens amidst these tensions? I walk into base camp. I'm not aware of this kind of fighting that's going on. That's me pointing to the clouds. And then if you look at the flags that are flying, they were actually flying off the mast of our radio transmitters. We had a very powerful radio setup in base camp, which would become critical in the next few days. Our satellite phone would work occasionally, but crucially we had this very strong, powerful radio setup at base camp. So on the 10th of May, the teams ascend, but the South Africans, now what's going to happen is they've made their way through the Khumbu Icefall, up a number of various camps, and they're now sitting at Camp 4 at about just under 8,000 meters. Anything above 8,000 meters is called the death zone. And they're going to head now for the summit. So the South Africans, unfortunately, were caught in a storm on their way up, and they decided to delay their attempt until the following day. So they stayed behind. So this is where all the teams now find themselves. They're on this shoulder between Everest and Lhotse, the fourth highest mountain in the world. It's called the South Col, and you'll hear the name South Col come up quite a bit. And this is where they camp. They then have to make their way up that very, very steep slope of Everest, and then you get to what is the South Summit, that little bump just before the top summit. Between the South Summit and the true summit, you have the Southeast Ridge. And the Southeast Ridge is in places only a few meters wide. You cannot climb tethered to somebody else, because if Mr. Wilkes falls, he's going to pull me with him. And depending on which side he falls, it's either a 3-kilometer plunge into Tibetan China or a 2-kilometer plunge into Nepal. So the joke is, have your passport. Both sides are very tricky when it comes to having your papers. But it's a very, very dangerous route between the South Summit and the true summit. So just to give you an idea of the geography of it. The South Africans, when they were trapped in the storm, we couldn't get hold of them on our radios. And this was very, very unusual for our team. So I want to play you a little piece of audio here, and then I'm just going to talk to it. This is Rob Hall, the New Zealand legend, radioing us once he had determined that the South African climbers were safe. Just got to... Before you check your hearing aids, you probably couldn't hear most of what was being said there. And the reason for that is that Rob Hall was talking on a handheld radio to his own base camp on a handheld radio. And this becomes critical because that form of communication on Everest is very, very difficult if you don't have those big masts like the South Africans had. But I want to point out something else about his communication. Notice he says everything twice. He says, I can confirm there are 3 South African packs, meaning people, arrived on South Col. To the best of my knowledge, they're not in the best condition, they're not in their best condition, but are okay, and on South Col. He's making sure, this is textbook stuff, that he is getting his message through, and he is not assuming that you heard him the first time. This is the way people need to communicate in a very dangerous situation like Everest, or when there's a lot of pressure or potential confusion at stake. So that is how one should communicate. 3 days later, Rob Hall would be fighting for his life on the mountain. At midnight, he led his team, along with Scott Fisher and Makalu Gao from Taiwan and his team, up that slope. So if you're looking at that image now, if you look behind them, that's the South Col from whence they were climbing since midnight. And throughout the day, we hear the cheers go up in base camp, one by one, people cheering as their climbers radio that they've made it to the summit. And all seemed well. It seemed like a brilliant day, and that the weather conditions were absolutely correct. This is a photograph I took that afternoon. You can see the weather's changed somewhat in base camp. We started to gear up into our down suits because it started to snow. But we had no idea what was going on higher up. And then suddenly the New Zealand base camp sent out an urgent message for help. It turned out that there was a massive storm that had hit higher up in the death zone, and 21 climbers were missing in whiteout conditions. They had no idea where they were. So Philip Woodall, Ian's brother on the left, he took a handheld radio and he went across to the New Zealand base camp, while myself and Deshaun manned this very powerful base camp radio station from our own camp. And then, of course, we had our climbers at Camp 4. So we had 21 climbers missing in the storm, and Rob Hall was desperately trying to get an American climber, Doug Hansen, across that very narrow southeast ridge that I was talking about. Now, the rule on Everest is if you cannot get yourself across the Southeast Ridge, nobody should help you. You shouldn't help someone or try to get someone across that Southeast Ridge because it is so incredibly dangerous. It's each man for himself on that stretch. And Hall felt desperately sorry for Hansen because the year before, he turned him around just before the summit. And Hansen was determined that this time he would make it. That's a picture of the Southeast Ridge. So just to give you some idea just of how absolutely narrow it is, there's some Sherpas laying ropes. And now we discover, as climbers are separated in the storm, that not everyone had a radio, including some of the guides, which meant that the expeditions, these big, powerful, wealthy, experienced expeditions, could not talk to their own leaders or some of their guides at a time of crisis. And then during the night, all communications was lost. I want to try and play you another piece of audio. There are some subtitles here. And what this piece of audio shows is, well, I'll play it for you and then I'll explain.
Yes, I copy that. At the moment, we don't have communication. You are the only channel we have to Camp 4. Over. Yeah, I understand that, Philip, but I'm not sure what good communication to Camp 4 is going to do you, because it doesn't look as though there's anybody else here who's going to go out. Over. Sorry, Patrick, can you relay that to me, please?
Yes, Philip Patrick here. He was saying that he doesn't know what the communication to him is going to do, what good it's going to do you, because it doesn't look as though anyone from Camp 4 is going to be going out. Over.
Okay, 10-4, I copy that. I'll relay that inside to the organizer. Over.
Okay, base camp standing by.
So what that radio communication was is you can hear that Philip in the New Zealand base camp is trying to talk to his brother up on the South Col, and they can't hear each other. And the way we got around that is I was able to relay the messages because we have this powerful base camp set up in the South African base camp. And anything that Philip can't hear, I can tell him, and anything Ian can't hear, I can tell him. So we're kind of triangulating our communications that way and not trying to go handheld to handheld. The problem with handheld is that Everest is so big and there's so many mountains. Sometimes the climbers are on the other side. There's no line of sight. The signal does not get through. So nobody at this point, it doesn't even enter their minds that perhaps the New Zealanders and the Americans should switch their rescue operations and their communications to the South African camp. You know, the little guys they were fighting with who they didn't want up on the mountain. They kept sticking with trying to communicate with their own people and coordinate their own rescue efforts via handheld radios. And the problem was these established leaders had been neutralized by the storm. They were nowhere to be found. They weren't communicating. They were in a desperate state. And this leadership vacuum in base camp meant that, in fact, there was no rescue operation that was being properly coordinated. The woman who was trying to do it, Rob Hall's base camp manager, she was a stay-at-home mom of 4 who helped climbers make tea and make sure everything was comfortable in base camp, but she was not a mountaineer. I'm not going to play the next audio because you've pretty much heard it, but Bruce and Ian then leave their tents. They try and find some of the climbers that are supposed to be coming back down from the higher camps, and in fact find 2 British climbers who are trying to climb up in the storm and rescue them. But Ian Woodall did one thing that would cast him as the villain in the books and the movies that have subsequently been written. And this is what happened. Woodall was accused of refusing to lend his radio to John Krakauer, a very famous climber and writer, and well-known journalist who was part of Hall's expedition. It was a damning allegation, and I want to show you what John Krakauer wrote. He said, "We knew the South Africans had a powerful radio and that it was working. So we got one of their team members at Camp 2 to call up to Woodall on the South Col and say, 'Look, this is an emergency. People are dying up there. We need to be able to communicate with survivors in Hall's team to coordinate a rescue. Please lend your radio to John Krakauer.' And Woodall said no. It was very clear what was at stake, but he wouldn't give up their radio." Damning allegation, right? Problem is that quote is fictitious. The only South African team member at Camp 2 was a Sherpa called Nawang. Now, Nawang could barely speak English. It was yes sir, no sir, up, down, rope, food. He didn't speak in that, hey buddy, there's an emergency up there kind of way. He also, Woodall said that someone had radioed him to give up their radio, but that person had not identified themselves. It was unlikely Nawang would have done that. So Krakauer's quote is fiction. It's what he thinks Nawang said to Woodall. Right? And he fails to portray this communication as speculative. And I'm reminded here again, of Mr. Armstrong. He says, why do people publish newspapers? To make money. John Krakauer, very famous journalist, he also wrote the book which was made into a movie called Into the Wild. Sean Penn made a movie of that. But he was under huge pressure to get his book out before the Christmas retail season in America. This guy made millions and millions of dollars from the book Into Thin Air. You can still find it in your nearest exclusive books. But he took no time to double-check the record or even ask for any of the radio recordings which I was recording in base camp. And more than 20 years later, this incident still haunts Ian Woodall's reputation, even though it was a questionable accusation. And the problem is Woodall did nothing to defend himself at the time. And if you think of in the world of social media, the times that we live in right now, someone questions your reputation or says something damning about you, your company, your family, your school, that can go viral in minutes. Okay? Meanwhile, at base camp, we're still trying to sort out what's happening with the storm. Our generator would pack up in the cold. I managed to get one report through to 702 that night to tell them of the disaster. But by morning, 4 climbers had succumbed, including the American leader, Scott Fisher. Rob Hall was still alive, but he was too frozen to move. He'd summited Everest 5 times before, and it had been assumed that he could not fail. His team honestly thought that he would save the day. After another night on the mountain, he no longer answered his radio. It just went silent. There's a scene in the movie Everest, which came out, I think, 2 years ago, where he's patched through to his wife, and they name their unborn child. And sadly, it's true. It wasn't a piece of Hollywood fiction. It really was the case. 3 climbers had also died on the north face of Everest, which we didn't know. 3 members of the Indian climbing team, a military expedition, along with Scott Fisher, Rob Hall, then in the middle, Yasuka Namba from Japan. Andy Harris was one of Rob Hall's guides, and then the American Doug Hansen, who Hall was desperately trying to get across that southeast ridge. Now, there were a lot of injuries. Most of the 21 that came down had frostbite of some sort. This is a guy called Beck Weathers, an American doctor. He would lose his nose. He would lose parts of his face. They actually reconstructed his nose from his ears. Here he is afterwards, here on the bottom right. You can see he lost his one arm just below the elbow and most of his one hand. Makalu Gao, the Taiwanese climber, he lost all of his fingers and his toes. And so we have this catastrophe. We have dead climbers up on the mountain. We have a lot of injured people. And most expeditions now abort Everest and leave. The South Africans come back down. There's a picture of Bruce Herod and Ian Woodall. And at this point, I'm thinking, this expedition's over. They rest for a week. I'm thinking, to go up now, you're going to be the last team on the mountain. We weren't successful. And it's going to be called off. But climbers are a stubborn bunch. And after just a week of resting, they decide that they're going to go back up. And the climbing party will be Bruce Herod, Cathy O'Dowd, Ian Woodall, and the 3 climbing Sherpa. So once again, they're going to head up these various camps to the top. And on the 25th of May, the weather is looking particularly good, and they leave for the summit. Now, Ian Woodall and Cathy O'Dowd were exceptionally fast that day, but Bruce Herod was lagging somewhere behind. This is a picture taken by Cathy O'Dowd looking back. You can see the 5th highest mountain, Makalu, behind us, just to give you some idea of what the view is like on your way to the summit. And then we've got a little piece of audio here, the following.
We have 952 and the Nepalese and South African flags are flying on the summit of Everest.
So just if you couldn't hear that, that was Ian saying we have 952 and the Nepalese and South African flags are flying on the summit of Everest. And we go bananas in base camp. And it's beers and live crossings on 702, and Ian's mother phones in, and next thing Nelson Mandela phones in, and it's just a massive celebration, right? Ian and Kathy and all three Sherpa had made it, but on their way back, they come across Bruce Herod, who wanted to keep going for the summit. Now, Ian made a fateful decision to let Bruce continue. But we have to have a look at that moment. Bruce had 2 hours to reach the summit. There's a self-imposed cut-off time of 2 p.m. If you haven't reached the summit by 2 p.m., you must turn around. Furthermore, Bruce was on par. He was doing what most climbers would do. He was at that point on the mountain that he should be at for a typical successful summit, right? And he also had to go across that treacherous southeast ridge all by himself. If anyone was with him, they're just there for polite company. They can't help him if he gets into trouble. The problem is, having agreed that Bruce can go to the top, he doesn't answer his radio well after the 2 p.m. cutoff time. And then shortly after 5 p.m., Bruce radios us from the summit, 3 hours past the self-imposed cutoff. There's just a short clip here of him speaking to us from the top.
It's been a long time coming, mate, and I'll be real careful on the way down.
He says, it's been a long time coming, mate, and I'll be real careful on the way down. Well, you know, he would now have to descend in the dark. He would have to make it across that treacherous southeast ridge by himself. He's probably running out of oxygen, and he's in a desperate state. At that point, the satellite phone rings, and it's his fiancée in London, and we patch them through. Her name was Sue Thompson, and she was brilliant. She was like, Bruce, focus, just keep your head on staying on the route and making it down safely. But sadly, we never heard from Bruce Herod again. This photograph was found in his backpack. His body was found about 2 years later by an American expedition, and the lead climber had the presence of mind to put his hand into the backpack, and he retrieved Bruce's camera, and this was his last photograph. We know that he's on the summit because of that kind of weather tripod that was put up by the Americans in 1975. If you get a photograph of yourself with that, it's kind of proof that you were at the top. And Ian would be widely blamed for Bruce Herod's death, for letting him go it alone, you know. And unfortunately, Ian, again, is his own worst enemy. Angry at the criticism, he shuts down all communication from base camp. I'm not even allowed to report to 702 because he wanted to come down the mountain and he wanted to control the message on his own terms, which would take him 3 days to get back to base camp. The Mountain Club of South Africa said Bruce should not have been alone, that he should have been accompanied by another climber. This angered Ian Woodall because the Mountain Club of South Africa has never attempted to climb Everest, and you know, you have this Southeast Ridge issue. And Ian's reply didn't help. We went on radio and said that the Mountain Club of South Africa could not organize a piss-up in a brewery. Yeah, you can see why I'm a consultant now. So the team returned home under a cloud. Nelson Mandela very graciously accepted them, but the victory was tainted by, you know, this death and this tragedy. So just in conclusion, some of the lessons I think that are pertinent from this Everest expedition, in which I often talk to executives about, or management teams, is first and foremost, you need to pre-plan your reputation. Okay? Protecting your reputation is about how well you plan ahead. It's not about how well you respond in a crisis. It's about the work that you do that others never get to see. So let me expand on that a little bit. So it's not how well you react in a crisis. It's how you scenario plan. The second thing is that people matter. Regardless of the situation, be it Everest, a corporate environment, government, a school, how you treat people should be a thought-out and documented policy. And at this point in the room, all the executives groan, and the HR person goes, yeah, a policy. But if you don't do it, you never get it into your mind and into your organization what it is that you are and how you treat people and how it should be. So it's not like a manual where you get a grumpy old lady phoning the call center and the call center agent must go, page 56, grumpy old person. How do I respond? No, it's not that. It's about that what happens is that this becomes a beacon for everyone in your organization on how they should communicate and what their personality should be and what their tone should be. So, for example, the South African team had Nelson Mandela as their patron, but failed to use his values and his diplomatic style to engage with the other expeditions. When Hall and Fisher said, listen, we don't want you climbing the route, you're young, you're inexperienced, you don't know what you're doing, you're going to cost us money, they should have said, listen, let's talk. Let you leave half an hour before us. We'll follow. We won't clog the route, you can have the Hillary step first. Or, let's share oxygen. There were other ways of approaching it, other than right out of the blocks, telling them that they could get stuffed. The other thing is that other people matter. Everest is so high that even helicopters couldn't rescue some of the climbers at the highest camp. And in an emergency, you're going to be forced to turn to one another for help. It's somewhat ironic, actually, that the New Zealanders ended up asking the South Africans for help to try and get oxygen to Rob Hall, when initially they didn't even want them on the mountain. And these other people are quite simply your stakeholders. And I see this time and time again, is that people get so stuck in their dynamics and their conflicts with their competitors that they don't evaluate the relationships with other people and then identify those with whom you have a poor or bad relationship. And then how can you mend that and seek common ground, right? It doesn't mean that Nissan is always going to love Ford and Mercedes-Benz is going to love BMW, but they will have some common ground and some common interests. And you can't have that competitor mindset alienating you from one another. I think this one's pretty obvious. Expect the unexpected. Nothing goes according to plan forever. But you must predict the possibility of a crisis or a failure. I was talking to some young entrepreneurs the other day, and the one guy is making tons of money flying industrial-sized drones, big drones, massive drones, over the city, helping architects, over crops, you name it. And I said to him, so what's the biggest risk to your business? And I said, so what happens if your drone falls out of the sky, lands on someone taking their kids to school and kills somebody? He said, oh, it's too awful to contemplate. I said, well, you've got to contemplate it. It's one of the biggest risks of your business. If you haven't worked out already what your reply will be to a massive crisis like that, you've got a problem. I was working with a social media company the other day. They use everyday Joes to tweet about brands and stuff. And so, well, your biggest risk is someone goes rogue. How do you mitigate against that if you haven't planned for that scenario? So you have to, think ahead. On Everest, the greatest risks were death and injury, and yet there was no predetermined protocol on how to respond. In fact, 702 had no policy on what would happen if someone in our team died, or if I died, or something went wrong. It was just, go to Everest, have a jaw, let us know how it was. So what are the key risks facing your business or the scenario in which you find yourself and you need to plan? Technology is available, so use it. $65,000 per person in 1996, and not everyone had a radio? Are you kidding me? That's insane, right? So when the radios failed, they had no backup plan. There was a coup in Turkey recently, about 2 years ago. There was an attempted coup in Turkey. The soldiers did exactly like coup 101, like from the handbook. They stormed the local radio stations and the local television stations, because that's what you do. You cut off communication so the president can't address the nation. Well, he just whipped out his iPhone and spoke to them on Facebook Live. Okay, so President Erdogan had a backup plan. And then there's something about a crisis, and I just want to talk about it briefly, is about silence. And the problem with silence is that the cost of its damage is unquantifiable. With previously mentioned motor manufacturer, what was happening is the accountants and the lawyers were saying, if you admit liability, you're in for 4 billion rand. There's a 4 billion rand reason why you should just keep quiet. The problem is people who say, don't be silent, talk, They have no hard figures on which to turn to. And that means that what happens is the directors, the bosses, opt for the guy who can actually put up a number. Because you can't quantify what silence will mean to your business. If you had missed. Look, failure isn't a dirty word. In most cases, nobody planned to fail. There was maybe just beyond your task maturity, or there was an unforeseen disruptor. Think Uber, or think a snowstorm. And then, being a media guy, this is one that's important for me, is that, you can't control the media. Woodall enforced this blackout from Basecamp until he returned. But the problem is that in the absence of information, and this has never been more critical in the digital age, in the absence of information, speculation and uncontested accusations from other sources will determine the narrative. They will decide what the facts will be. So it is now, 20 years later, 22 years later, absolute fact that Ian Woodall simply refused to hand over radio. It's not written in any of the books. Or wait a second, we had a really crummy radio operating system. Our leaders were missing, and we in fact should have switched our operations to the South African base camp, because that's what a bit of research would have thrown up, right? So-called facts presented early on will dominate the narrative unless you can change that message. So you can influence the message, but it will all go around your pre-plan messaging according to your scenario planning and your value system. And in a chaotic situation, you will lose the ability to influence the narrative significantly. So it's very good to have an outsider, a third party, someone you can trust, who will give you unemotional advice at a time when you could be really worked up. So perhaps a schoolboy does something, Mr. Reeler, that gets you really hot under the collar. It might be a good idea to have just a third party set up already, and turn to James and say, listen, James, you're not bothered by this. What do you think the best thing is to do? Ultimately, the decision is still yours, but so are the consequences. And then stability trumps perfection. Well, obviously not. It's great if it could be perfect, but, leaders bring a situation to the most stable point possible, not the ideal. And what happened on Everest is that the big established expeditions, we're going to do it our way. Our leaders will solve the problem. Our leaders will get them out of the storm. Our leaders know what to do. And in fact, really what should have happened is there should have been a shift in strategy at that point. Because it was clear that there were going to be people who were never going to come home. But the people in base camp just couldn't see that. Finally, ask Google. Your reputation isn't what you say it is. It's what others say when they Google you. So make sure that you guard your reputation in the digital age, because as I say, the space-time continuum is a lot faster in the digital space. To trash a reputation and to trash it unfairly has never been more easy. There is more fake news out there than ever. Digital technologies have democratized information and marginalized the truth, because people can just punt whatever they want out there, and it can be perpetuated. Just think Trump. And finally, leaders have a big impact on a reputation. The skills required to succeed are obviously a strong will, determination, intense focus, and strategy. That's why people are very, very successful, particularly in business. However, these can be a counterforce in a crisis if the assumed outcome is based on the current or past reputation of the leader. It's not a guarantee that because someone did something well yesterday or has been a good leader up until this point that they can necessarily get you out of a crisis. So on that very note, I just want to say thank you very much. It's been a privilege talking to you, and thanks again for the invitation.